Hello, everybody. This is Moxie with Squibbler, and you're here for your weekly Wednesday webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about writing conflict. This is going to help you intensify your narrative with conflicts. And this can apply to fiction, to screenplays, but also to memoirs. So in this webinar, you're going to learn the types of conflict that exist in fiction. We're going to learn some tips for creating gripping conflict, and then we'll take a look at a couple of tips from the pros. So as I was thinking about this webinar, one thing came to mind to me when I think about conflict, and it is the white whale from Moby Dick. This is an example of a powerful conflict that in fiction. The heart of the story that Melville wrote here is so strong that we can understand and identify it, even with modern terms, even when whaling is not common anymore. So even though many of us will never read this book and may not have read the book, and it's 200,000 words, we are familiar with the idea of the white whale being the heart of the conflict here, that we have a captain who wants revenge for an animal that has attacked and torn off his leg. This is a powerful, powerful example of conflict. Why is conflict so important? It's the key in most narratives, and it's going to include a learning arc. This applies to screenwriting fiction, as I said, and some forms of nonfiction that do have a narrative in them, like memoirs. Your narrative is not just the plot here. And in fact, telling someone the plot of your tale can lose their interest if you just tell them what happens in your story. Your narrative also involves what the conflict is and how your protagonist or protagonists are going to respond to conflict. There are two main types of conflict. You probably remember, high school or middle school where you learn man versus machine, man versus nature. There's a broader rubric or category here. There is internal conflict. This is a struggle within a character, and this can be an emotional, moral, or psychological challenge. And this is the kind of thing we often see in memoirs. There can be external conflicts as well, and these are struggles between characters or external forces. So these are those ones that you've learned in high school or in middle school. Man against society, man against man against nature, man against technology. So there are multiple ways to map out the conflict of your narrative. So as you're thinking about plot, you also want to think about the structure of your conflict. But what we're discussing here is not just a one-size-fits-all pattern. Just as there are many ways to develop your plot, there are many ways to build the conflict in your narrative as well. We are going to take a look at some of the most common ways conflict is introduced into many books and films. So one of the first things that you'll see with conflict is the inciting incident in stories and in narratives. And what happens here is that this is where the first spark of conflict is going to be introduced, and it's going to disrupt the character's status quo. They're living their normal life. Things are going along fairly well. Something interrupts their happiness and their normal way of life. The purpose of this inciting incident is to force your protagonist to react, choose, or face the challenge. It establishes the stakes. We know it's at stake at this point, and it begins the narrative momentum. It's going to set your narrative into motion. So an example here of the inciting incident is going to be from the Hunger Games, where Katniss volunteers to take her sister's place in the games. And this is going to thrust her into the central conflict of survival. In a romance novel, it could be something like the meet cute moment, where two characters clash or are forced to a situation that sparks tension. The next part of conflict that you see in structure is the rising action. So what happens here is that the conflict is going to intensify as the protagonist faces increasing obstacles. There are subplots oftentimes. There are secondary conflicts that often emerge and add depth. The purpose of the conflict is to reveal the protagonist's strengths, their flaws, and motivations, while it also builds tension. It also introduces complications, reversals, or betrayals that make success for the hero seem less certain. An example of the rising action and conflict in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is when Harry faces these escalating challenges in the beginning of this series, where he has to learn how to use magic, where he has to learn to fit in with his friends. He is uncovering the mystery of the Sorcerer's Stone, and he's battling his own personal security, so he has an internal conflict, and rivalries, which are his external conflicts. The next plot structure relating to conflict is climax. So, what happens here is the ultimate confrontation is going to occur, where the protagonist is going to face the central conflict head on. This is the turning point of the story, where stakes are at their highest. The protagonist's choices in this moment are going to reveal their growth and resolve. So, an example of this would be in The Great Gatsby, and this is the climactic confrontation between Gatsby and Tom. And it's going to reveal the futility of Gatsby's dream and leads to the tragic resolution that you see in the novel. In action-packed scenes, this might be the final showdown between the hero and the antagonist. So, in something like The Matrix, this is where Neo is going to fight Agent Smith for the first time. The next part of the structure for conflict is the resolution. What's going to happen here with your conflict is that it's going to be resolved, and this can happen positively or negatively, depending on what your goal is for your narrative. And the story is just going to tie up loose ends. The purpose here is that the resolution is going to showcase the consequences of the protagonist's choices and growth. So it ties not just into the plot, but also to your character development. A tip here is that a satisfying resolution is going to tie back to the original conflict. It's going to leave room for lingering emotional impact. It's the kind of thing that happens when you finish reading a book or you finish watching a really good movie that you want to discuss with someone else. So an example here of a resolution with conflict is in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth and Darcy are going to overcome their misunderstandings and their pride. They're going to resolve the romantic conflict, and it's going to deliver a satisfying conclusion. In tragedies such as Romeo and Juliet, the resolution is often going to reinforce the themes of loss or consequence as well. Another thing to keep in mind when you're developing conflict is the genre that you're writing. Conflict varies in its nature and the stakes and intensity across different genres, shaping the tone, the pacing, and emotional resonance of a story. So we're going to take a look at some books and movies across genres to illustrate how conflict is tailored to fit the specific demands of each storytelling style. So you might take a look in this discussion about the genre you're writing and how the conflict tends to work and be successful in that genre. So the first example of genre and conflict, we'll talk about romance, and we'll use the example of Pride and Prejudice again by Jane Austen. So the conflict here is Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy clashing to mutual understandings, societal pressures, and their own personal flaws, which are pride and prejudice. So how does the conflict shape the story here? The romantic conflict between the protagonists is primarily internal. They're focused on their evolving perceptions of each other and then their own personal growth to become a couple. The external factors are also in play here, like family expectations and societal norms. And this is going to add to the layers of tension. The story's resolution feels satisfying because the internal conflict, where Elizabeth overcomes her prejudice and Darcy his pride, is resolved in tandem with the romantic plot. Why does this work? The emotional stakes are really high because the character's personal happiness and their societal status are at risk. And this really invests us as readers into their journey. For thrillers, if you're writing thrillers, a good example here of conflict is The Silence of the Lamb by Thomas Harris. So the conflict here is Clarice Starling, the FBI trainee, who has to track down serial killer Buffalo Bill while interacting with the manipulative and enigmatic Dr. Hannibal Lecter. So how does conflict work here? The thriller genre thrives on high-stakes external conflict. The race against time here is to save Buffalo Bill's victim, and it's often a really good idea in thrillers to have some kind of a time constraint as well. The story also layers in psychological conflict. Clarice is very vulnerable, and her tense mental chess game with Hannibal Lecter is going to add complexity and tension. So the interplay between physical danger that we see in the story and in the book and in the film is going to play with the psychological manipulation that Clarice Starling is facing, and this keeps the readers and viewers on edge. So Harris does this very well by combining the two internal and external conflicts. Why does it work so well? The dual conflicts are intertwined, and it's very fast-paced, and it's an edge-of-your-seat experience. Another example of genre and conflict, we're going to talk about fantasy. And Lord of the Rings will be our example here. And the conflict, of course, is Frodo Baggins has to journey to destroy the One Ring. But it's also corrupting him, and it's sought by the Dark Lord Sauron. So, how does conflict shape this story? Fantasy also often uses epic external conflict. The battle between good and evil is a pretty popular one. And this is represented in Tolkien's story with Frodo's quest against Sauron. But what Tolkien adds here is the internal conflict. Frodo is constantly struggling against the ring's influence, which threatens his morality and his sense of self. The supporting characters, like Aragorn and Boromir, also have conflicts that echo the central themes of temptation and loyalty and sacrifice. So it's very powerful in the way that Tolkien develops this and continues to play with this idea of seduction of power. So why does it work? The balance of large-scale external stakes, saving Middle-earth, also is accompanied with deeply personal stakes, which is Frodo's inner battle. And it's going to create emotional depth along with the spectacle of the fantasy that we see. Another example here, genre and conflict, is in horror. And I was thinking about the film Get Out by Jordan Peele. The conflict here is Chris, who is a Black man, uncovers the horrifying truth about his white girlfriend's family and their sinister intentions to take over Black bodies. So how does the conflict shape the story? The external conflict involves Chris's struggle to physically survive and escape from the family's trap. The story also leans heavily on social and psychological conflict, addressing themes of racism, microaggressions, and exploitation. There's a constant interplay between the everyday comfort of being in a hostile environment and the escalating terror is going to create unrelenting tension. Why does it work? The horror arises not just from physical danger, but also from the deeply unsettling social commentary, making the conflict resonate on multiple levels. Another example here is for sci-fi and genre. We're going to take a look at the book The Martian by Andy Weir. The conflict here is that astronaut Mark Watney is stranded on Mars, and he has to use his ingenuity to survive until he can be rescued. So the primary conflict is man versus nature. It's Watney's struggle against the harsh environment of Mars. The secondary conflict are internal. It's about his isolation from humanity. And the challenge that he faces by NASA and with his crew also lead to a mounting rescue mission, which is an external conflict. The conflict shaped by the genre's focus on science and problem solving, and the tension is going to come for each new survival challenge Watney encounters. So why does this example work for genre and conflict? The conflict is engaging because the stakes are life or death, but the humor and optimism in Watney's character make it deeply human and relatable. Another example of genre and conflict here is historical. Schindler's List is based on the book by Thomas Keneally, and the conflict is Oskar Schindler, who's the German businessman and protagonist, is initially profiting from World War II, but he becomes conflicted as he witnesses the horrors of the Holocaust and decides to save Jewish lives. So how does the conflict shape the story? The external conflict involves Schindler's efforts to protect Jews under the nose of the Nazi regime. The internal conflict, though, is equally as powerful. Schindler experiences a moral awakening and transformation. He becomes less self-serving, and he becomes a humanitarian. He becomes selfless. The historical setting here is going to amplify the stakes as the characters face unimaginable danger and moral dilemmas in a time of real-world atrocities. So why does this work in the book and in the film? The juxtaposition of individual courage against the backdrop of massive inhumane conflict makes the story both deeply personal and universally impactful. So here are some tips to help you, no matter which genre you're working in, to develop conflict. There are a couple of things to remember, and there's a reason that I just went over some of the genre examples. Your conflict should, to some degree, match genre expectations. Thrillers, for example, demand fast-paced, high-stakes tension, while romances are going to focus more internally on emotional and relational struggles. You do want to try to blend internal and external conflict. This will develop your characters. Even in plot-driven genres like fantasy and sci-fi, the internal struggles is what makes characters relatable, multidimensional, and interesting. Theme also drives conflict. In genres like horror or historical drama, conflict is often going to underscore larger social or moral themes, such as in the examples we just saw. And these enhance the story's depth and resonance. Another tip is to think about balance with your conflict. Great stories rarely just have one. Usually, you're balancing primary and secondary conflicts in novels with your characters. And that can make your narrative more layered and engaging. So, here are some tips to help you achieve this balance. The primary conflict is the central struggle that's going to drive your story. It's tied to the narrative's main goal and often spans the entire narrative. So, an example of the primary conflict is in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo's goal is his quest to destroy the One Ring. In the To Kill a Mockingbird, the primary conflict revolves around the trial of Tom Robinson and Atticus Finch's fight for justice. So, along with your primary conflict, you may find it useful to have a secondary one, and that's a subplot or smaller struggle that complements the main conflict. These can arise from relationships, internal dilemmas, or external events. And the purpose of this is to add complexity and depth to characters. It can provide emotional contrast or relief from the intensity of the primary conflict, and it can reinforce themes or contribute to character growth as well. Some more tips here is to keep the primary conflict central. You want to ensure that the subplots and secondary conflicts feed back into the main story in some way. And most of the time, those subplots and secondary conflicts are for character development. You also want to make sure you're pacing your conflicts. Don't overwhelm your readers by resolving or introducing too many conflicts at once. Stagger those resolutions for maximum emotional impact. You can also use secondary conflicts for contrast. If the primary conflict is heavy and dark, a subplot with lighter or more personal stakes can create balance. Again, as we said, conflict just drives the story. It's not the plot driving itself. It's what your character wants and how they're going to achieve it. So ask yourself how every scene or beat in your screenplay is going to escalate or resolve this conflict. Your primary conflict should be clear. Readers need to know what's at stake and why it matters. The secondary conflicts do enrich the story. You can use them to develop characters, explore your themes, build tension without distracting from the main plot. Your resolutions for your heroes and protagonists should be earned. The protagonist's growth and choices should naturally lead to the resolution of both primary and secondary conflicts. To create successful conflict, we have a couple tips for you as well. Create authentic, relatable stakes. Even in fantasy and sci-fi, we need to believe that the conflict is believable. We may not be Ellen Ripley fighting a malicious alien in space, but we need to believe in the conflict she's facing. Stakes matter to readers. It engages us. You do want to identify the personal stakes. Are they relationships? Are they internal conflicts? Versus the universal stakes, which could be survival. You want to think about character-driven conflict as well. Develop multi-dimensional characters with opposing desires and values. That can really make them interesting. Use flaws, fears, and motivations to fuel conflict naturally. You do want to keep your readers and viewers tense. Keeping tension escalating by using reversals, complications, unexpected twists is really going to keep them hooked. Try to avoid melodrama or forced drama. It should feel sincere to the characters involved. You don't want to write something that sounds like a soap opera. You do want to layer your conflicts as well. Blend internal and external struggles for depth, such as we saw with Frodo. You know, he has this external struggle of getting the ring and destroying evil, and his internal struggle of not letting the ring consume him. Most people facing an external conflict will also face an internal one. Those questions are, can I do this? What if I fail? So you'll use these subplots to add complexity. You also want to use dialogue and action for conflict. Write confrontations with sharp, purposeful dialogue. You can avoid cliches and melodrama this way. And you can also generate a scene in Squibbler to create sections with more dialogue in them. You can show tension through action and body language as well. And one way that you can accomplish this is with elements in Squibbler. And when you set up your elements, make sure they're well defined, because the AI will take those definitions and create the tension that you see in actions, body language, dialogue, if you have your elements well defined and your characters well defined. You want to write conflict resolutions that satisfy your reader. Don't rush through the story. Don't provide overly convenient solutions. They should make sense. Ensure your resolutions tie back to character growth and story themes. A good way to get feedback on this is to try to get a beta reader who enjoys reading the genre that you're writing or the screenplay. They enjoy watching the movies that you are writing. They can tell you if they feel that your resolution is rushed or implausible. So we're going to move on to some tips from the pros here. One of the tips we have is to streamline your conflict. You want to cut subplots that don't serve your purpose. You want to cut any side characters or lengthy backstories that don't directly serve the main plot. Films, especially, this is important because they have a limited runtime, so every scene has to count. John August, who wrote Big Fish, says that you want to figure out what's essential to your work. The movie cannot contain everything from the book, and it shouldn't try, right? So if you're working from book to film, this is some good advice from him. Another thing to think about is opposing goals. You want to create characters with opposing goals. This is why we have an antagonist and a protagonist. And one of Kurt Vonnegut's famous quotes here is that every character should want something, even if it's just a glass of water. We all have wants and needs, and those can conflict with the wants and needs of other people. Conflict is going to arise when characters' goals clash. Each character should have a clear motivation, and their desires should create obstacles for one another. This is going to create natural tension and keeps the story dynamic. Another tip is a practical application here is ask yourself what each character wants. Make sure their desires are incompatible or mutually exclusive, and that forces them into conflict. So an example would be from the TV series Breaking Bad. Well, Walter White wants to provide for his family, but Jesse, his partner, wants to survive and escape chaos. Their conflicting priorities fuel ongoing tension between the two of them and make for really strong writing. Another tip from the pros is to raise the stakes. The most important thing, said Sid Field, who wrote Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting, says, the most important thing is that the protagonist cares deeply. The higher the stakes, the stronger the conflict. And you want to put things in the way for your character as well. This will develop more tension. The audience is only going to care about the conflict if the characters also care. So whether the stakes are life or death or deeply personal, they must feel significant to the characters. An application here is to identify what your character stands to lose. Are they going to lose a relationship, their dream? Are they going to lose their survival? That you can gradually increase the stakes as the story progresses. An example of this, again, to return to the Hunger Games, is the stakes that Katniss faces for her own survival and the safety of her family. As the series progresses, the stakes grow to include the fate of an entire nation. You do want to make your conflict active and not passive. William Actors, who wrote Your Screenplay Sucks, says that drama is conflict and conflict is action. So what does this mean? Conflict needs to be shown through actions, not just through dialogue or internal monologue. Characters should actively struggle to achieve their goals. They need to make choices that create consequences. So an application for this would be to place your characters in situations where they have to act decisively to overcome obstacles. You want to avoid relying too heavily on arguments or exposition to showcase the conflict. So an example here would be from the recent film Mad Max Fury Road. Conflict is constant because the characters are in motion the whole time. They're racing through the desert while being pursued. This is going to keep the action, the tension visceral and engaging. And there's not much exposition. Nobody's explaining why they are chasing each other and what they're chasing each other for. It just is, and it really ratchets up the tension here as well. One other tip is to use ambiguity. You can add complexity this way. Aaron Sorkin says that when your characters are making decisions, give them a moral dilemma. That's where you find a really juicy conflict. So the best conflicts often don't have right or wrong answers. When characters face difficult, morally gray choices, it deepens the story and makes the audience more invested. You want to create situations where no solution is perfect and every choice has consequences. These moral dilemmas can reveal deeper aspects of your characters' personalities. And one example of this is going to be from the fantasy series Game of Thrones. We have so many conflicts that involve morally ambiguous decisions, such as Daenerys' struggles between justice and power. And this keeps heightening the tension because we know there's great cost no matter what the choice is. Another tip from one of the pros is to maintain tension. And this is from Gillian Flynn, the author of Gone Girl. She says, if you're ever stuck, make things worse for your protagonist. Don't let them off the hook too easily. That's difficult to do because we do love our characters, but you want to create a compelling narrative for them as well. Conflict should escalate through the story, with temporary setbacks and complications keeping the tension alive until the climax. By delaying the resolution, you're going to keep your readers engaged and create a more satisfying payoff. So just for fun, before we leave this webinar, we do recommend the Conflict Thesaurus. You can check out this book from Angela Ackerman and Becca Pugalist. It's very helpful for when you're trying to come up with obstacles, adversaries, inner struggles. It'll help you understand the fundamentals of writing conflict as well. We also recommend using tools like the rewrite function in Squibbler, more inner conflict. That can help you to intensify the feeling of inner conflict for your characters that have inner struggles, or for yourself if you're writing a memoir. You can also use the rewrite, more intense function in the Smart Writer to develop internal and external conflict in your writing as well. So in this webinar, we have reviewed the types of conflict we find in fiction, tips for creating gripping conflict, and then we have a couple of tips from the pros as well. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, as always, for joining us, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.